And that really ushers in the question of perception. How do we perceive vulnerability? Well, firstly, we have the causes of disaster. These create the hazards. They could be natural, technological, social, or intentional. Intentional disasters by and large mean terrorism. Social, well, things like crowd crushes, riots, and so on. Technological, of all kinds, from toxic spills to transportation crashes and so on. Natural, well, the earthquakes, floods, storms, and so on that we're so used to. We have the history of these things. What does history tell us about the vulnerability of places and about past impacts? Not only the history of single events, but also the cumulative impact of past disasters. There is often a very different attitude to disasters in places where they occur constantly and frequently than in places where they are very infrequent and uncommon. But then we have human cultures. Culture is a way of looking at things. It's a framework, a social framework for looking at things, and it offers both constraints and opportunities for understanding hazard, vulnerability, and disaster. So the way that societies adapt to risk rather depends upon the interaction of these three things: the hazards, the culture and the perception of events, and also the perception of the history of events, not merely of the phenomena themselves. And all of that needs to be reduced or mitigated by creating resilience, a more resilient culture and a more resilient society somehow. We do some of that by technology, although it is something of an error to put too much trust in technology, because technology has two sides to it: the side that its makers intended and the side that they didn't intend. Technology, therefore, is constantly a source of both risk reduction and risk creation, a source of vulnerability in its own right. If you are, for example, dependent on the internet for your daily work and so on, what will you do if the internet ceases to work? Well, how we view these things depends on our cultural filter, which is operative at all sorts of levels, from that of a single individual up to that of society as a whole. And when we apply the cultural filter, we can perhaps be technocentric, in other words, have a strong belief in the power of technology to reduce risk and vulnerability, or more sociocentric, where we're perhaps a little more skeptical about whether technology holds the answers. But certainly culture holds the answers as much as technology does, because culture determines how we use technology. So when technology is used, there is a benign and a malign side to it. The benign side to it is the development of technology, which is quite ceaseless. It goes on and on to reduce risk. The malign side or malignant side to it is technology as a source of risk. Now that can be both inadvertent, where accidentally the technology creates vulnerability or the dependence on it does, or deliberate, where technology can be used as a source of risk. For example, flying planes, aircraft into the World Trade Center. So there are several sides to technology, and how we view that, how we operate with that, how we manage that depends on the risk management practices that we adopt via decision making, which depend in turn on the cultural filter and the way we perceive the development of technology in these three contrasting directions. So culture is an interesting phenomenon in its own right. It's desperately difficult to measure, but it's definitely important. When we are born, we inherit culture. That's the red box at the background. As we grow, we accumulate culture. In other words, our life experience gives us a culture. How we grow up, where we grow up, with whom we grow up, gives us culture. But there is also a process of cultural metamorphosis which is strongly driven in the 21st century by the development of technology, and that's the yellow box on top. Now, there was a linguist called Kenneth Pike who invented two terms, etic and emic. An emic thing is something that is culturally specific, and an etic thing is something that is culturally universal. Now, wherever you go, you can say Coca-Cola and people by and large know what you mean. And that is etic. It's an etic concept or an etic thing. You could call it Coca-Colonization, if you like. But if you go to Indonesia and say to the people there, Pele is the god of volcanoes, they'll probably look at you as if you're an idiot. On the other hand, if you go to the Caribbean and you say Pele is the god of volcanoes, people might well agree with you, because that is an emic concept, it's culturally specific. So somehow out of this we have to understand our attitudes to vulnerability and to hazards in terms of our cultural matrix, the way that our culture is developed and the way that our culture conditions how we do look at vulnerability. So how do we arrive at enlightenment from ignorance where it comes to hazards and vulnerability? How do we decode an emergency when it occurs? Well, we receive images of reality, and right from 20 minutes after the moment we're born, we start to develop our understanding of the world via the creation of symbolic constructions. You could not leave the room that you're in if you didn't understand that a doorway is something you can go out of. It's as simple as that. So we have very many symbolic constructions that we use in order to interpret the reality we see around us, which we interpret through a perceptual filter and a cultural filter in order to obtain and interpret the information that we have that will tell us what is going on and what we need to do to survive. So in this process, when risk is there, when it manifests itself, when it shows itself to us, we perceive it and we interpret it through our culture, through a cultural filter. We might do so very accurately, we might do so rather inaccurately, but our decisions and the actions we take on the basis of decisions are based upon the way that we interpret things culturally, and the result comes out of that. It might be positive, it might be negative, it all depends. So what we often find with disasters is, because they tend to be recurrent events, even cyclical events, for example, meteorological events are often seasonal, but earthquakes even perhaps occur on a rotating basis once every 30 years, 100 years, 200 years, whatever it be. So when large disasters occur, there is a strong demand for greater safety, for the reduction of vulnerability, a demand to spend money on the problem in order to make us all safer. There is, however, then, when there is no disaster, a return to complacency and probably a reduction in expenditure. There's always a shortage of money, and therefore there's always a desire to economise in some way, and often that is economising on the safety measures. And that will increase vulnerability, increase risk, and increase its major component, vulnerability to disaster, until along comes another disaster and there is more demand again for greater safety. Now here's an optimistic view of that, where things get safer year by year. If you took the pessimistic view, you'd take that red line and you make it go upwards with a few stops and starts in it. But by and large, the vulnerability reduction, the risk reduction, tends to occur after disaster, because that is when public tolerance for hazards is at its lowest. The public have seen panoramically the destruction that disasters can cause. The politicians will respond to public demand for greater safety, and that's when we get the measures introduced, the expenditure, the resources devoted to vulnerability mitigation and reduction. So in some ways, the evolution of a typical safety culture is something where disaster occurs, bang. It can be sudden impact, it can be slow impact, but whatever. There comes to a point where it is acute, more or less quickly. At that point, there's a public outcry. There may be recriminations and rhetoric. I accuse you of not reducing vulnerability. The politicians are under stress. And then finally, a colder logic will be applied. Well, what can we actually do to stop this happening again? And the result is that laws are passed, regulations as well, and things are done to make life safer. We end up with something of a safety culture. So that's how it occurs. Now, in this diagram, there is no backsliding towards greater vulnerability, and you could add that to it, but this is the optimistic view. So now, supposing you finish your studies and you go out and you work in this field, you may find at times you wonder whether it's all worthwhile or not. This is the yellow part on the diagram, actually. And in this yellow part, which can be quite prolonged and protracted, you might be preparing to make life safer, reduce risks, reduce vulnerability and so on. Not much is going on. But when disaster does occur, that really shows what you've done in the times of peace is highly catalytic to reducing impacts when they do occur. So in fact, quite often there is no easy way to see the fruits and the results of vulnerability reduction until suddenly, panoramically, if they've happened, they are revealed by a lower death toll, less destruction, fewer casualties, and other fruits of better preparedness.